Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 19th of February in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Donald Trump proposes large levies on imports of cars and other products in his latest tariff salvo.
The US says Russia's sanctions will remain for now as the US administration urges Ukraine to sign an economic partnership.
Plus, sparing no expense. HSBC announces a big profit beat as the bank doubles down on its drive to cut costs.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Donald Trump says he will likely impose tariffs of around 25% on all imports of cars, semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. The US president says he plans to announce the new charges on the 2nd of April. European and Asian automakers, including VW and Hyundai, could face the biggest hit from the levies. America currently imports around 8 million cars and light trucks each year. Speaking to reporters at his Mar-a-Lago club, Trump doubled down on his plan to rebalance the US's trading relationships across the globe.
It'll be 25% and higher, and it'll go very substantially higher over a course of a year. But we want to give them time to come in because, as you know, when they come into the United States and they have their plant or factory here, there is no tariff. So we want to give them a little bit of a chance.
The new charges would come on top of Trump's previously announced 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium imports set to take effect in March. Last week, the US president also ordered his administration to look into imposing broad reciprocal tariffs on trading partners across the globe.
As Trump looks to remodel America's global trading relationships, his administration is continuing its efforts to shrink the US federal government. At the centre of that effort is Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency team, who have faced criticism and lawsuits over their approach to cutting spending. But speaking to Fox News Channel's Hannity alongside President Trump, Elon Musk sought to justify the approach.
The overall goal is to try to get $1 trillion out of the deficit. And if the deficit is not brought under control, America will go bankrupt. This is a very important thing for people to understand.
Musk's comments to Fox News came as a US judge rejected a bid for immediate court intervention from Democrats who say that he does not have the authority to reshape the US government and its spending. Meanwhile, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that Musk's DOGE team have already identified an estimated $50 billion in savings. He told Fox News that taxpayers don't need to worry about the Musk's team approach accessing their private data.
I think it's unfortunate that they're trying to kind of lampoon what Elon Musk and the DOGE team's doing. I think it's very unfortunate they're trying to be fearmongers with the American people.
Bessent also told Fox News he thinks Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky will sign an economic partnership agreement with the US that hands over half the value of Ukraine's vast mineral rights to the US as compensation for aid. The US Treasury Secretary says that Trump wants to show Ukrainians that the US supports them, whilst demonstrating to US taxpayers that there will be a return on the money that has already been sent to the country.
The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has told European allies that the US will keep sanctions on Russia in place, at least until a deal to end the Ukraine conflict is reached. The assurance comes after America's most senior diplomat held face-to-face talks in Saudi Arabia with his Russian counterpart for the first time since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Speaking after the meeting, Rubio insisted peace talks would include all major parties.
The first next step is working through our respective teams at the diplomatic side just to ensure that our diplomatic missions can function. There's been a series of reciprocal actions taken over the last 10 years that have really diminished our ability to operate in Moscow, as an example, and they would argue their ability to operate in Washington. We're going to need to have vibrant diplomatic missions that are able to function normally in order to be able to continue these conduits.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking in Riyadh after talks that excluded Ukraine and European allies. Russian officials were also upbeat after the talks, hailing the prospect of pulling relations with the US out of the deep freeze, even as they ruled out concessions such as allowing European troops into Ukraine to police a peace deal.
The UK Defence Secretary says Britain needs to rearm to deal with a new era of threat from Russia. In a speech, John Healey said that he wants to make the Ministry of Defence run like a FTSE 100 company. He says it's the biggest shake-up of UK defence for 50 years.
As a new government, we're delivering for defence over these first 7 months. We've stepped up and speeded up support for Ukraine. We've increased defence spending this year by nearly £3 billion and will set a path to spending 2.5% of GDP in the spring.
Healey wants investment in the armed forces to be paired with reform, with the UK military being asked to ensure better value for money for its £20 billion budget. While the government has pledged to increase defence spending to 2.5% of UK GDP, there are concerns from both military figures and the new US administration that it won't be enough.
Hamas has offered to free all Israeli hostages in exchange for the country's full with Gaza, aiming for a permanent ceasefire. The two sides are preparing to enter negotiations on how to achieve a second phase of the ceasefire. Israel says it seeks the total removal of Hamas as a governing and military force in Gaza. The current framework expires in early March.
Now to some earnings. HSBC expects to cut expenses by $1.5 billion a year as part of its global restructuring programme. The lender detailed the plans whilst reporting fourth quarter pre-tax profit of $2.3 billion this morning. The numbers, which beat analysts' estimates, came as the bank announced a $2 billion share buyback. But our senior bank analyst, Thomas Nutzel, says that the savings fall short of expectations.
This is the lower end of the range, which was cited by media. 1.5 billion, it will come from probably mostly from wages and salaries. It's around 8% of the wages and salaries for HSBC. We haven't heard any numbers for job cuts, so I think this is a little bit disappointing. We're expecting a little bit more details where the cuts will happen.
That was Bloomberg Intelligence's Thomas Nutzel speaking there. In a statement, HSBC CEO George El-Hedry said his team is creating, quote, a simple, more agile firm. His remarks come after leading the bank for roughly 6 months, during which time he has wound down some investment banking operations and seen the departure of top executives.
Those are your top stories on the markets. Yesterday we saw the S&P 500 hit another record high, finishing up by 0.2%, helped by tech shares, Intel shares jumping 16% amid breakup speculation. European stocks also ended higher. The stock 600 up by 0.3%, more strength in defence and banking names at play there. The Treasury yield, the 10-year yesterday rising 7 basis points, dragged lower in price by the continued weakness in European bonds. We've got that 10-year yield hovering at 4.55% today. After the dollar strengthened by 0.2% yesterday, it's a touch weaker in trading today. We're looking at the euro at 104.58, up a tenth against the dollar this morning. Stocks in Asia, the MSCI Irish Pacific Index down by 0.2%. The Nikkei in Tokyo is 0.3 lower as well. Concerns about the latest tariff threats from the US on car makers among those that are at play this morning. So some of the shares that could potentially be affected by that, or some of the companies that could potentially be affected by that as well. Thinking about the likes of Toyota and Honda, they're under pressure this morning as well. Toyota shares down by 1.9%.
So those are the markets. In a moment, we're going to bring you more on President Trump's 25% tariff threat and possible Putin summit, plus HSBC's cost-cutting plan. But another story has caught my eye this morning. One of the greatest collections of marbles and Roman antiquities is finally being opened up to the public, Stephen, and Bloomberg Businessweek has the most amazing account of how that has happened, how Giovanni Torlonia and then his son Alessandro came to have this huge collection, the Torlonia collection, 622 pieces, a neoclassical villa in the heart of Rome, which has an additional 1,000 antique objects. Now, some of this has been shown in recent years, but Bloomberg Businessweek got to go inside, actually, where they're doing a lot of the restoration, have a look at some of those marbles. The pictures are incredible.
Yeah, it's a great story, but even getting into the building seemed like a bit of a challenge for our colleague James Tarmy as well. This is in anticipation of an exhibition that's going to happen at the Art Institute in Chicago as well, so some of these pieces will be shown. But essentially, it sounds like walking into a museum that might have been closed for a while. A lot of these magnificent artworks still covered up that haven't been displayed publicly as well. So really fascinating story, and one to look forward to ahead of that exhibition opening next month.
Now, Europe is reeling from proposals in Riyadh that the US could cut a deal with Putin to end the fighting in Ukraine, but perhaps sacrifice the security of Ukraine and of Europe. Now, President Trump may also dramatically escalate the trade war as he proposes tariffs of 25% on pharmaceuticals, vehicles and semiconductors. Joining us now is our senior editor, Bill Ferries, to discuss. Bill, a very good morning to you. Is President Trump going to settle the war in Ukraine perhaps on Russia's terms or more on Russia's terms?
Well, things are moving so quickly now. Literally, it was just over a month ago that the Biden administration was shoveling all the weaponry and money it could out the door to help Ukraine fend off Russia. Now we've had these talks in Riyadh, 4 hours of talks. And yes, to your question, the critics of the Trump approach say that the administration has already signaled some key issues that Russia has wanted, which is no NATO membership for Ukraine, basically an end to a lot of the military support, U.S. troops not being on the ground in Ukraine in a post-war scenario. So the critics say that a lot of this has taken place publicly. I think Marco Rubio tried to be a little more measured in his comments following those 4 hours of talks in Riyadh. But it is clear that this is moving very quickly. President Trump even saying that he could be personally meeting with Vladimir Putin possibly by the end of the month.
What about sanctions in this as well? The US and Europe have sweeping sanctions in place on Russia's economy and indeed on entities and individuals therein. Is there something that there's perhaps the door open to things being changed on that?
I think one of the more surprising things we heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio was that he talked about all the promising economic opportunities there would be if the U.S. and Russia could get over this dispute in Ukraine. So certainly that would require at the very beginning getting rid of some of these U.S. sanctions at the very least. It came in very hard in late 2021 or early 2022, and have had a big impact on the Russian economy. But the U.S., the new administration already kind of talking past this future where a peace or some sort of a deal has come to Ukraine and the U.S. and Russia can restart economic ties.
What does all of this mean for Ukraine? Because there have also been various demands for mineral rights and for elections in Ukraine.
Yeah, it hasn't exactly right. There hasn't been a lot of information from the U.S. side on what Ukraine would get out of this besides an end to the conflict. There looks like they'd be forced to end this with Russian troops on captured Ukrainian territory. They've been asked to give up about 50% of the profits to any development of critical minerals to the United States. But the U.S. hasn't said what kind of guarantees it would give Ukraine. So President Zelensky of Ukraine canceling his trip to Saudi Arabia to try to attend some of these talks. He said he wasn't invited, and he doesn't like the idea that there are talks taking place without Ukraine's input.
The other story, of course, we're monitoring out of the US is the latest threats around tariffs, 25% on pharmaceuticals, on cars, on semiconductors. This is a plan that's due to be announced now in April. What more do we know?
Yeah, President Trump making some vague comments about 25% on these different sectors. So it's gone from beyond the reciprocal tariffs and the steel and aluminum tariffs that we had talked about to hitting directly on the automobile, semiconductor, pharmaceutical, medical technology sectors. And he said it would be around, he would talk about it on April 22nd, around the neighborhood of 25%. It's clear that he it tends to continue pushing this tool. You need a complicated spreadsheet now to track all the deadlines of when some of these tariffs come into play. But those kind of things that are set off several weeks in the future do give countries and companies an opportunity to try to either negotiate with the Trump administration, or if you're a company, to say, hey, maybe we can try to relocate some production into the U.S. But when you look at something like automobiles, that could potentially hit 8 million autos that get imported in the U.S. That's half of all new auto sales in America. So it would be very hard to avoid a big inflationary impact if that comes to pass.
OK, Bill, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Our senior editor, Bill Ferry, is joining us on that trade story. The EU's top trade official is actually travelling to Washington this week to meet counterparts in the US government in a last-ditch attempt to avoid being hit by duties, perhaps in April. We're not exactly sure yet.
Yeah, indeed. And just another strand of this as well. We know the US has been very interested in some of the rare earth wealth that they see Ukraine as having. And our opinion columnist, Javier Blas, an expert in commodities, writing that, in fact, there's no evidence that Ukraine has these sort of resources or rich mineral endowment that it would be able to hand over to the US as well. He points to the US Geological Survey not listing Ukraine as having any reserves, and particularly not of the kind of rare earths like lithium, for example, that could be very valuable. And he says that it would be a folly to presume that there would be some sort of huge benefit to be had from excavating rare earths in Ukraine. You can read Javier Blas's piece, bloomberg.com/opinion.
Let's think about earnings now. From Europe's largest bank, HSBC, fourth quarter pre-tax profit was a big beat at $2.3 billion. But the bank has also announced a major restructuring programme for the next 2 years. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's senior Asia finance correspondent, Ambereen Chowdhury. Ambereen, good morning. What can you tell us in terms of the overview of what HSBC announced this morning?
Yes, good morning. You know, there were a lot of expectations in what was going to be announced, but the actual statement was a lot more muted than expected, albeit the fourth quarter profit numbers were pretty good. You know, it beat expectations at $2.3 billion. They also announced a $2 billion share buyback, which is great news for shareholders. However, what analysts will be looking for today is perhaps more details on their massive restructuring. So what they have said is that they are taking, there's going to be a $1.8 billion in costs linked to severance packages and other upfront costs, which they haven't really detailed on how many staff are to be let go at this point in time. And this particular cost will be taken over this year and into 2026.
Yeah, and indeed, that cost cutting a key part of the CEO Georges Elhedry's plan since he took over his leadership at the bank last September as well. In context, how big a change is it that's being proposed at HSBC?
Right. You know, with the new CEO, George Elhedry, who was the previous CFO, are very much focused on numbers, as to be expected. He's been at the helm for roughly 6 months. And HSBC has essentially witnessed one of the biggest upheavals in more than a decade. So he's wound down some of the lender's investment banking operations across Europe, the UK and Americas in a bid to focus on areas where it can as it says, better serve its corporate and institutional clients. And these broad moves have also seen a slew of top execs heading for the exit. And, you know, in a nutshell, he's honed the focus on the bank to Asia and selective markets in the Middle East. And the important thing to note is that he has warned staff and the general, you know, in the investment community that he was going to take and act as such. So days after taking over from the previous CEO, Noel Quinn, he told a town hall meeting in Hong Kong that he'd be focused on keeping a lid on costs. And essentially 6 weeks later, he unveiled a revamp that also involved creating a new global commercial and institutional banking unit to which combines the lender's two largest divisions. So you've got now Hong Kong and the UK as a standalone business. So, you know, he's been a very busy man.
Yeah, I mean, they had a huge footprint, didn't they? I was reading something like 100 different countries, so that's been pared back quite a bit. What of the $2 billion share buyback and also HSBC's share price?
Right. The buyback, they have been doing share buybacks over the last few quarters or since, let's say, at least 12 months. So that's not surprising. I think the amount was slightly lower than expected. But shareholders are generally pretty happy with the share price. You know, it surged almost 15% this year to date in London. And they were up around 1% in Hong Kong trading after the results announcement. They actually started off slightly lower early this morning. So it appears that given the share price turnaround, investors are generally happy with the results.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.